Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited today to have a coach and author and leadership expert, Kadi Cole, with us. Kadi, thank you so much for agreeing to be on the podcast today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here.
You have done so many things over the course of your career, from nursing to managing multi-churches and just leadership consulting. One of the questions that I love to kind of start people with is kind of that big overarching question of how would you describe the calling that God has placed on your life?
Oh gosh, that is a big question.
Yeah, just come out swinging.
Yeah, I do have a really eclectic journey, especially professionally. But for me, honestly, it's always come down to I am really oriented towards helping people. And I think as I've gotten older and the more I've been involved in church ministry, particularly, I'm very passionate and feel very called to help people who feel outside the kingdom be in. And not so much from an evangelistic standpoint specifically, but really there are people that should be a part of a Christian community that have a role in the kingdom that God has called. And through lots of different reasons, a lot of times they don't feel like they're a part of it, or they don't belong, or they shouldn't be there, or they don't even know they could be there. And I'm very passionate about helping the whole kingdom rise up and be everything God has designed us to be.
One of the phrases that I love from your website is the term lift the lid. I wonder if you could kind of talk to me about the birthplace of that and how that came to be.
Well, I think for me growing up, especially when I look back, I see that I had a lot of lids on me, either from the very kind of low income experience growing up that I had, or I grew up in the mountains of Montana. We were a big city for Montana, but it's basically the size of my church database now. And that was a lid I didn't know was there. I put a lot of lids on myself, both just assumptions from culture and my family that I grew up in, a lot of assumptions I made from the church culture I grew up in, or the filters in which I read scripture. And so for me, a huge piece of being able to help people discover and really walk in their calling is identifying those lids that aren't from the Lord, that we have sort of lived under, and help lift them. And whatever that next step is, sometimes I always feel bad because I'm not really someone who has this big vision for my life or a, big 20-year plan. I sort of am a opportunity-driven person. I feel like God just keeps opening doors and I keep walking through them. But I am very passionate about us knowing where we are and what that next door of opportunity is, and what is the thing that God's, challenging us or inviting us into that would lift that lid that's preventing us from being the most Christ-like version of ourselves and having the most impact in the kingdom that He's designed us to have.
I think that that's a vision that everybody wants. And one of the things that I notice when I talk to leaders is that oftentimes they don't have that appreciation for lids in their life. And so I'm curious, as you work with leaders all over the country, in the church, outside of the church, what's like your go-to strategy to identifying a lid? Like, how do I know if I even have one?
Well, I think wherever there is a lid, there's always some sense of angst or hurt or disappointment. There's usually a negative feeling or emotion or something that's got us a little stuck. The Lord has an amazing way of revealing those things to us. Sometimes it can be clear, like sinful behavior, and we have a little bit more insight on that. But the places that I usually focus, once we get those kind of baseline things out of the way, is where are you frustrated? Where do you feel like you're striving? Where is it that things just aren't coming together? What is a reality in your life that you're having a hard time accepting? You just want it to be different. And even though I know it's true and I'm going through the motions, my heart isn't in it. My passions aren't aligned. I don't feel whole or integrated in those spaces. These are all kind of like the words I'm looking for when someone comes to my studio and they're like, I'm trying to figure out my calling. I'm trying to understand my mission, or I'm trying to go to this next level and I'm stuck. We try to figure out where are those emotions at, because they tend to be indicators, not of the issue. They tend to be indicators that there is an issue, and where to start looking around for the clues that point us in the right direction, that we can start to uncover that lid.
You've made some pretty big shifts in your career. Started out in the healthcare industry, went to work at in the church world, did some mission stuff, executive pastoring, executive directoring, and all that kind of jazz. How do you discern God's call in your life when it's time for a pivot?
Great question. And I think one of the challenges that many leaders have, especially if you've been successful in your leadership, is you will have opportunities. And so it's never a matter of if the opportunity comes, I should say yes. It's, is this the right one? Is this the right time? Of these couple that I kind of see on the horizon, how do you discern which is the right one? So a few things. First of all, I found that those opportunities that God brings to me almost always align with my giftedness, or I'm
Mm,
free to operate out of my gifts. So I try to encourage people, when you look at a job opportunity, or you maybe are going to be promoted into a role that someone has left vacant, who the person that was there before isn't really the roadmap for you to be successful. Am I someone who can be successful in this? So I remember when I took over kind of the first impressions team at my church, the person who had been there before was like a 65-year-old retired policeman. And so he had a certain way of operating. It ran a certain way. I had very different gifts than him. And so I came in and I did take it to the next level. I did, lift a lid on that ministry, not because I undid what he did, but I brought in my own set of gifts on top of those systems and
mm,
structures and kind of processes that he built. But I did it using my main gifts. So administration, teaching, encouragement. So we had a different kind of culture. We did a lot more trainings. It was a little less legalistic, but I still appreciate processes and systems. We created leadership development systems. So I want to know that I can bring my gifts into it. And then secondly, does it line up with my life? So
mm,
a lot of times callings and opportunities come along, but the season we're in and other priorities, especially when it comes to work decisions, my relationship with God, my family, my own personal health, the other things, the other callings, I would even say, that God puts on our life. And I find this primarily with male leaders. They tend to feel like they have one calling, especially those in ministry leadership. There's like this singular calling around the mission of the church, not realizing that they're being a husband, being a dad, being a son, being a friend, being a spiritual leader. All of those things are part of their calling. They all interact. And so you have to really look holistically. As you get older and your life gets more complicated, sometimes we solve one aspect of our life or calling and we break two others. The goal as we get older is that when God brings an opportunity, you actually get a win in 3 or 4 areas at one time. That's one of the great confirmations that
mm.
I'm moving in the right direction.
Yeah, a guy I had on the podcast named Joe Judge, he always says that a life living with integrity is a fully integrated life. One of the passions that you have developed is the idea of female leadership specifically, and how to create a culture that promotes that and works to promote female leaders in lots of different ways. How did you get onto this topic, and when did it kind of become a passion for you?
Yeah. Surprisingly enough, not till the last few years. I know I've been a female leader like my whole life for many
Right.
decades now. You'd think I would have been
As
working on this
it's
the
funny because
whole
as I was
time.
saying that question, I was like, "Well, this sounds so dumb, Tony," but I knew what I meant when I asked it.
It's a good question, at least for me. To be honest, I really didn't think about it. I grew up with a single mom and one sister. So I grew up in the house of women where we all did everything. I went into a profession, nursing, which is primarily female oriented. So I had a lot
Hmm.
of really significant, strong female leaders in my professional early life, which really formed a lot of how I viewed myself, or the things I was capable of doing, or what I could aspire to. And then I went into ministry where there were almost no women. But by then I had a graduate degree. And so I was specifically brought on by my pastors to help bring some leadership and organization at the executive team. And so for me, I didn't really realize many of the challenges that most women have. In fact, when I look back over my leadership journey, I can say that one of the challenges for me was that I often ran into issues around female leadership because I was the only woman on the team, particularly in ministry. And 25 years ago, there was a
Oh,
lot
sure.
more dynamics. I got paid a lot less. I had benefits I didn't know I could ask for, just things like that. And I really took it personally that I wasn't a very good leader, that I didn't know how to cast vision, that I wasn't good at advocating for myself. I see now that those things are really not true. They were probably more dynamics in the system and the culture I was a part of. But I personalized that and really thought I was, barely a mediocre leader because of it. So as I've gotten older, and as I particularly as I started consulting churches, we kept running into this issue of launching campuses or launching church plants or creating new initiatives and not having enough leaders. And as I popped the HR kind of hood on the car, it really came down to female leaders were not progressing in leadership pipelines. And I was like,
Hmm.
what is this about? I haven't really looked at this or thought about this. So I started researching. And really, as I worked with churches, it was pretty clear that these male pastors particularly were doing such a good job trying to reach out to women, trying to make space for them, wanted them a part of the team. But what women were hearing or what their experience was really didn't match the heart of their senior leader. And that gap between what a senior leader was trying to build in his church for female leaders and what women leaders were actually experiencing and what they thought was open to them was such a big chasm. I was like, if we could solve that chasm, we could unleash thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of women in the kingdom. And again, that aren't included. This is what I'm really passionate about.
Yeah.
Who should be in places that they're not in places? And so I did a big research project. It ended up getting turned into a book. And now this is what I speak and consult on quite significantly in my business.
Obviously, this is probably an unfair question since you spent years doing the research. But what was kind of the root of the chasm? What prompted this from a senior leader who had a heart for bringing in female leaders but then actually they didn't feel that same growth opportunities?
I would say it really comes down to, and I'm going to put myself in this category because I think one of the things I learned in the research is how many biases I hold against women, including
Mm.
myself. But I am guilty of many of the same ignorant practices that many men do, but really bias, unconscious bias, like being ignorant of how my decisions or our decisions as a leadership team or the way we phrase things or the way we position things really is not doing what we think it's doing. And so that's why the book is really written for male leaders and why I primarily work with men to try and help bridge the gap. And even though I was a part of those cultures, I mean, I grew up in leadership for the last 25 years with all these guys. We read the same books, we went to the same conferences, we were mentored in the same practices. Many of us just didn't stop and really think about it. And now we've got this sort of dynamic in which those things really aren't working for us anymore, but we don't know what's wrong. Now, I am a female leader and I've experienced the other side of it. And so that's why I spend a lot of my time trying to translate between the two groups, is I really do feel like I can see it from both sides. And we're so much closer than we feel like, but it does take quite a bit of work and some strategy on the leadership side to make a difference. So can I give you a couple examples of sort of
Yes,
these?
I would love that.
Yeah. So one of my favorite, and I hear this quite often is I talk to a senior or executive pastor, maybe a campus pastor, and he's like, I've got this great female leader. She's probably either new to leadership or she's a little younger. But it doesn't even necessarily mean younger in age. It's not like she has to be 23. Like sometimes a
Sure.
young female leader is 35 or 40, right? They just haven't been in church leadership much before or any leadership. I've got this great female leader and I want her to learn, I'll just use a pastor as an example, I want her to learn ministry. I want her to get a feel for things. She's really sharp. I hired her as my admin assistant so she can come to all the executive meetings and sit in on strategy and meet all the players and learn how it all works. Now, that kind of feels like a great way to introduce someone into leadership and to put them in the spaces where you would learn a lot of leadership and be kind of mentored, so to speak. But when you actually are growing a leader, being an admin assistant is almost the worst possible job
Mm.
because you do all the setup beforehand. You're in charge of sending out the calendar invites. You take notes during the meeting. Yes, you're a part of the conversation or at least in the room, but you aren't actually contributing. You aren't actually seen as one of the players. And when it comes to leadership, being good at organizing a staff retreat is not the same thing as being able to lead a team meeting, as being able to be a project manager, as being able to hold people accountable. And so we end up with a lot of women doing a lot of support roles that kind of feel important, but they aren't actually a seat at the table and they aren't actually growing in leadership skills. And one of the ways I know this is because we almost never put men as admin assistants to the senior
Oh, wow.
pastor. If we bring them on, we call them an associate pastor. We make them an intern for a year and they're traveling to conferences. They're sitting at the table. They're getting leadership opportunities. They're running teams. They're managing projects. They're doing actual leadership. And so that kind of mindset where I'm really doing a lot to help this woman, but I'm not actually doing something that builds a leader, that is the thing that trips us up the most.
How do leaders, especially, I'm just going to ask for guy leaders, because I'm going to just cut away from the trying to say it politically correct, and I
We'll make
apologize in
this,
advance.
let's make this a safe place to ask awkward
Okay.
questions. How's that?
Yeah. As a guy leader, I'm scared to mentor a female for the look of impropriety, and like I want to give that younger leader a chance. I want to give her an opportunity, but also like I don't want to be like I've got some of my own boundaries and rules for my own, just because I know how people talk in the church, and how do we navigate the clearly those kind of tensions and differences?
Well, that is a fantastic question. And I would challenge that for most of us, particularly in church spaces, that protection is very important. I want to uphold that. I would just like to burst the Christian bubble and say you hanging out with a young man is not any more safe than you hanging out with a young woman and mentoring her. So we are well beyond the safety of gender only one-on-one relationships. And so
Mm,
we really need to rethink all of our leadership development practices and primarily get out of this idea that it has to be done one-on-one in this sort of like father-son relationship. And then women have mother-daughter relationships. And part of the reason is it holds women back because most men hold leadership roles, or most of the leadership roles are held by men, over
sure.
85% of them held by men. And so if women wait around to be mentored by a woman, they're going to wait a really long time and never actually be able to break into those levels of leadership. So we're excluding women from that. But again, we also are not updating our practices to be safe overall. So you probably know the a kind of leadership trick of always taking someone with you, right? You want to mentor
Sure.
someone if you're going to the hospital or a conference or teaching on a Sunday, take someone with you, debrief on the way home, mentor them along the way. I just challenge people to always take two people with you. Take a guy and a
Mm.
girl, take two guys, take two girls, double your leadership efforts instantly by simply having two people. Help them form a Barnabas peer relationship in the experience, which really has statistically incredible insights and application to them long term in terms of morale, development, staying on the team. All of those things get better when you have more friends, more peers in your workplace. But it also creates a level of safety and allows you to bring anyone along of any age, of any gender, of anything. You instantly become an accessible leader that's multiplying yourself, whoever God brings you.
One of the things you talk about in the book is you've got like kind of 8 easy to implement best practices, which I really appreciate the compartmentalized kind of like steps. I can kind of tell you wrote it for guys that way, which as somebody who reads a lot of books, right? Like just in the podcast world, one of the things that you mention is clearly define what you believe. And I think I'm hoping you might kind of unpack that for us a little bit, because I think that there are probably a lot of Christian leaders who are listening who've never done the work of unpacking their theological beliefs around female leadership and what does that look like. And so I'm kind of curious if you could take us down that trail a little bit.
Sure. Well, first of all, I grew up in a very eclectic experience on this topic. I grew up in a very conservative church. I went to a college that was much more progressive on this issue with female pastors. I served the majority of my ministry career in a church that started off very conservative and then shifted over the years. I attend a very conservative church on this topic now. So my position is really not one from a theological standpoint. I am not a theologian. I am a leadership expert. So my goal is to actually support any theological viewpoint. And the leadership perspective on that I bring is defining what you believe and being able to communicate that to your church and your team is really critical. I think most men would be shocked, surprised and shocked at how much time and energy is wasted in female leadership, and also men who are trying to lead women or follow them in leadership, how much energy is wasted in confusion over this? Most women think when they run a meeting on a Sunday, if they lead some sort of serve team, like, I don't know, the hospitality team or something very benign, they're thinking, am I allowed to pray out loud with a man on the team? Am I allowed to correct someone who is a man? Am I allowed to even be a leader? In fact, most women take what I call girl titles because they don't want to offend any guys or cause any eyebrows to be raised in their leadership. And so when you don't have a title that says I'm leading this, it's really hard to lead because people question what you're doing and you look like you're kind of stepping out of line when actually you are the leader. So all of those things really come down to having a really clear understanding of your theology and then making sure that's being lived out in your culture. So unfortunately, most of us have grown up in a space where we feel like this is kind of a binary choice. I'm either for women or against women. That's kind of like how it comes down. I try to make a case in the book that I actually think there are 7 viewpoints along a theological spectrum on this topic, in which we have different kind of strengths on how we view scripture and then how that plays out in our culture, not just in our church culture, but in our home cultures and at the workplace. There are many churches who have pretty conservative viewpoints on women in leadership in churches, but feel that women can lead at all the levels in the marketplace. Well, that's a pretty complicated theology to try and explain to a woman who has to shape shift who she is and her giftedness. So if that's your viewpoint, please know it, please articulate it, and please explain it to women so they know how to function in all the different areas in which they have a calling. If you have a very extreme kind of perspective where you're like, we want women in very few roles, or we maybe want women in every single role, those are also very confusing for women because most of those cultures do not align to those theologies. So in our research, we found the biggest gap was not in actually what the theology was. It was in how consistent we are at implementing our theology across the span of our church. And in most churches, quite honest, like if your church is like most churches, every team runs a little differently based on who the leader is. And that creates a lot of confusion for women, especially when they serve on multiple teams.
So how do we, once we implement, kind of we define what we believe, how do we begin to create a culture that lets women as leaders thrive and kind of create that environment? Because obviously, like you said, everyone's got a bias. So we're all bringing our biases into the conversation. And so we've already got a developed team. Maybe we've neglected the culture conversation for a while. What's it look like to kind of walk this whole thing back and say, okay, let's spend some time talking about this and rethink where we are and what we've done?
Well, I think we have to really implement this as a change management process, like we would implement any other change that we want to make to our culture. So passivity is really not going to work because we will always kind of default to where the culture has been and the things that are most natural and easy for us. So I don't think it's impossible to do, but it does take some effort and you are going to swim uphill for a little while, which is why most of the things I write in the book are action steps, ways that you can move the culture forward, kind of some rhythms and standards that you can do to push things forward. And so as we do that, we have found actually it's been pretty easy in many churches to kind of shift this. Clarifying your theology is one of the biggest ones. I will just throw a warning out there to you. Usually the most resistant group to change is older women who grew up in very conservative culture, especially in American culture, women in their 60s and 70s who were told for decades, their whole life, that their leadership skills were probably sinful and to be corrected, not to be nurtured or developed. And now they see these younger women having platform that they never even imagined possible. And they have a biblical viewpoint that has nurtured their way they've lived their life. And so we have to be able to really unpack the scripture as to why we are making a change or why we are bringing clarity to this if it's not been clarified well in your culture, and help these women understand maybe where their own theology or their own teaching or even their own spiritual leaders led them in a different direction and why this is the decision we're making here. So going slow enough that you allow people to get their hearts and their heads around this topic is really important. I haven't really seen anyone lose a significant number of people. Well, anytime you create change, you're going to lose someone.
Sure.
But for the most part, if it's done with a careful pastoral heart and not a leader with an agenda to prove something, that pastoral heart, if you pastor people into this shift, most people are excited about it and can see the benefits within weeks or months of releasing women into greater roles of leadership. Again, whatever that limitation might be for you, you probably have ground to gain in that. The other is to really shift the narrative. I think most of us, if you've been in church for more than 10 years, most of us have grown up with teaching around this being very focused on what women are not allowed to do, which is usually 2 to 5 roles at the very top of the org chart. We tend to be very quiet on the hundreds, if not thousands, of leadership roles that women are uh, invited, and we want them to be leading in our church. And so I just really encourage leaders, if all you do is switch the volume, take the volume on what is not allowed for women to an almost zero, and take the volume on all the places you want women to lead to 99% volume, you will see a significant change. Most women are leading way below their capacity of what you have for them. They don't know they can be small group leaders. They don't know that they can run a meeting. They don't know that they should be going to the leadership rally on their own, not because their husband is there. They don't know that they can be teaching in student ministries. They don't know that they can be on a platform in the 5th grade room. They don't know because all they know is women aren't allowed to do a lot. And if I don't have clarity on where the line is, I will assume I shouldn't do anything unless you specifically ask me, which almost never happens.
One of the interesting questions I was talking about this interview with my pastor, and we were talking about the idea of culture. And I said, you got any questions for Kadi? And so this question comes from him. I thought it was a great question. You've got an extensive kind of resume. You've got business and church. In light of that, where's the healthy differences between like a good church culture and a good business culture? When do you see them intertwine? And how should the church handle being business-like? Because in a lot of ways, the marketplace has done a better job in this particular area than the church has. But then, we don't always want the church to be a business. How do you? What's your take on culture of the church and culture of the marketplace?
My personal opinion is I think we've seen a big pendulum swing. When I was growing up and first into leadership, we really were coming out of a church season where there really wasn't much leadership development in churches, and the business world had really kind of tapped into that and taken off. And so this is like early John Maxwell era, where all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, add value to people, see a 10 on their forehead. Sure. It was like riveting information. And so we started reading a lot of business books, incorporating a lot of business strategies, particularly around leadership development. I think that pendulum has swung pretty far to the other direction, where I see a lot of churches operating almost exclusively with business practices. Personally, I think that's too far. I don't think the church is designed to be a business. I think it's designed to be a family. And just like when I see strong leaders who are leading their families like businesses, where they're firing their third grader from setting the table, or they've got mission statements that their family has to live up to, we've missed the point of what family is. Family is really it's the dugout for the game. It's not the game. It's the place you come to huddle up. It's the place you come to get encouraged, to get coached, to get a slap on the back, to be corrected, to get a drink of water, to go to practice, to have a team that loves you. And then you go out and you play together. And I think, unfortunately, what we've done in the church world kind of holistically is when that pendulum swings from being too family, where we don't actually like organize ourselves or have music that you want to listen to on a Sunday, we swung it so far over that the level of professionalism or the standards are so high that we are just churning people in and out of church. And we're kind of okay with that, because as long as we are getting more customers than we're losing, we feel like our numbers are hit. I don't think that's the way family operates. That's the metaphor Paul uses the most in the New Testament, is family. I don't think we have more babies because a bunch of kids ran away. That's not like the way we parent. So I think we need to come back to the healthy middle. We always, as humans, we go from one extreme to the other. I think we've crossed the middle line. I think that healthy tension between being highly productive and also very family-oriented, honest, humble, knowing that we're pastors and shepherds, like we're actually called to care about all the sheep we have. as well as gain new little baby lambs in the kingdom. We have to do both, or we're really missing how kingdom and family operates.
One of the things I appreciate as I hear you talk more and more about the work that you do is that you're really intentional about serving both sides of the aisle, or all sides of the aisle, because maybe it should just be more than both. I think that there's a lot of leaders listening right now who struggle to be with someone who doesn't believe in the same thing that they believe in. Mm. What's your approach when you go into a situation where you know that you're ideologically maybe, I don't want to say opposed, but not aligned with someone? And what are some of the tips that you would give a leader who's listening, who's like, oh man, I got to go serve so-and-so, and they don't believe anything that we believe. Maybe they're on the opposite side of the political aisle. How do we bridge those differences?
Mm. Yeah, I think, part of it is the goal. What's the goal of your connection? Like, what's trying to happen? I think when it comes to building relationships, when it comes to working in the kingdom, when it comes to partnering with other people in ministry or business, or just even navigating your congregation, I think one of the big challenges for pastors right now is your congregation is more diverse. Even if it's the exact same people you had 5 years ago, their opinions and viewpoints are more diverse than they ever were before. And how do we be a family that's on mission when we have so many things that we don't align with? And so I think, anytime we are operating in those spaces, the first role is to make sure our hearts are right in terms of, God, what is your agenda here? What versus mine? I always can easily have an agenda. I'm a strategist. I have agendas for everybody. I mean, you want me to tell you what I think God wants for your life? I will tell you. but what my real job is as an ambassador for Christ is to actually try to prayerfully discern what is God doing in this moment, and what is his agenda. I had someone describe this as I've got a lot of little A agendas in my life, but I'm always on the hunt for what's God's big A agenda. And that will always trump my little A's. If I can't see it, if I don't sense it, if I'm not sure, I just keep going on my little A agenda as far as I can. But as soon as I get a sense of God doing something bigger or different, I'm going to acquiesce to that. And so I think that heart attitude of being sensitive to the Holy Spirit in the moment and prayerfully engaging people based on common ground, based on our unified love for God, based on our heart for other people. There's usually so much more that we have in common, even on this issue of female leadership. People ask me all the time, Katie, what's your opinion? I'm like, honestly, I don't ever talk about my theological opinion publicly. I don't find it's helpful in the work I'm doing, but also we're going to get to heaven one day and half of us are going to be very surprised. I don't know which half exactly, but no one really has a corner on the market on things that we disagree on scripturally. We don't know. There's a lot of things we don't know. And so if I go in with a humble attitude that says, I have my opinion, but I don't know if I'm right compared to you. I want to be open to what God might want to teach me in this interaction. And I want to be open and faithful to what he might want me to say or nudge or ask a question about if there's something that I maybe have learned that you could use. But again, it's not my agenda. It's really got to be what God is doing. I want to join in what God is doing. I don't want to try and create my own thing. I've done that enough. It doesn't work and it's exhausting. I'm only trying to do the stuff that God is in the middle of doing. That's where I want to put my efforts.
Amen to that. I love that. Okay, I've got one more question for you, but before I ask it, I know that my podcast family's going to want to connect with you all over the interwebs. Where's the best place to learn about the work that God has called you to and pick up their copy of the book?
Sure. So my website is the best place to go. It's my name, Kadi Cole, and that's spelled KADICOLE.com. And you can also follow me on social media at Kadi Cole. I do have a monthly newsletter, particularly around female leadership. If you're interested in those topics or the places I'm speaking, that kind of thing, that comes out once a month. You can sign up for that on the website.
Awesome. And we'll link to all that in show notes. So if you're driving right now, just come back and visit it later. Okay, last question I love to ask people. It's an advice question. I'm going to ask you to go back in time and give yourself one piece of advice, except I get to name the season of life that you're in.
Oh, that's good. I love that. Okay, give it to me.
All right. So I want to take you back to the end of your very first day on staff at a church, right? Your very first day on staff at a church. If you could go back in time, pull up a chair with that younger version of yourself, sit knee to knee with her, hold her hands, and look her in the eyes, what's the one thing that you want to tell her about the season of life that is to come?
Mm. I think I would tell her that you don't need to rush. You're going to have a
Mm,
big, long life in ministry, and you're going to have time to do all the things God has put on your heart. And I think that for me, and I think that for a lot of other leaders, particularly women leaders who feel like their time is short or they may not get another opportunity like this, that, God's will for us cannot be thwarted by anyone, including ourselves. And so he's going to bring about the things that he wants to bring about. Our job is to ride the wave that he sends and not go too fast and leave people in the dust.
that's a good word. You don't need to rush. I think that's important for all of us. Katie, I really appreciate the generosity of your time today and your willingness to navigate these important waters. I hope that we can stay connected and continue to dialogue more as you're continuing to do God's work in the kingdom.
Well, thank you, Tony. Thanks for all you're doing in the kingdom. And I would look forward to that.